This is a pretty short packet. This first packet, we're pretty much going to go through naming the various endocrine glands and then speaking about just the general flow of the hypothalamus and the pituitary axis. So a lot of what happens with regard to the endocrine system takes place in the brain. It starts with the hypothalamus, which is considered the master pituitary or the master endocrine organ. And then the pituitary, which is kind of like the second in command. So the second important gland that is also located in the brain. And so we'll start today by looking at some of the primary and secondary glands and then the general flow of communication and how those hormones get released. So first off, let's talk about what an endocrine gland is. An endocrine gland is derived from epithelial tissues. It's going to be those epithelial cells that are lined one against the other that form all of our lining tissue for body surfaces. They also form the lining tissue for all of our glands. Now, what sets an endocrine gland apart from an exocrine gland is that an endocrine gland releases something into the blood, and that we call a hormone. Whereas exocrine glands do not release their secretions into the blood. Their secretions are released by ducts, and then they release into some other body surface or body cavity. So examples of exocrine glands would be the liver, the pancreas, our salivary glands are exocrine glands. The breast are exocrine glands, and they release their secretions into ducts that go directly into some other body surface or body cavity. Whereas endocrine glands specifically release their secretions, which are hormones, into the blood, and then it enters the blood, is circulated, and it goes to a specific target site to bring about some other function. All right. Now, there are two types of endocrine organs. We've got primary endocrine organs that have a primary secretion. Their hormones have a primary job, a major function, whereas secondary endocrine organs, their main job is not an endocrine function. Their hormone secretion is a secondary function. So a good example off the back is the heart. So the main job of the heart is a part of the circulatory system. Is a part of oxygenating the body and circulating blood through our vasculature, but it has a secondary function, which is releasing an important hormone that acts as an endocrine hormone. So we've got primary organs that have a main function releasing hormone, and then secondary organs which have a secondary function in releasing those hormones. Okay. So let's talk about some of the primary endocrine glands. Those are going to be the hypothalamus and pituitary as the major endocrine glands. And these are located in the brain. We've also got the pineal gland, which is also located in the brain. There's the thyroid gland and parathyroids. These are located in the throat region, so the neck or the laryngeal area. They're going to be anterior to the trachea, also releasing hormones as their main function. The thymus, which is anterior to the heart, right behind the sternum. Then we've got the adrenal glands, which are on atop either kidneys. The pancreas. The pancreas is actually a very unique organ. It has both exocrine and endocrine function. And we'll talk more about the pancreas in the next packet. And then finally, the gonads, which are basically the reproductive organs, or the testes and the ovaries, are also primary endocrine glands, meaning that their main role is to release some type of hormone. Okay. Now, the placenta during pregnancy can also act as a hormone gland, and the main job of the placenta is to release important hormones that help to sustain the pregnancy. So these are our primary, or what we can call essential endocrine organs. Their main function, their one role, is to secrete some of those vital hormones that we're going to talk about. Now, secondary endocrine glands are examples, the heart, which also secretes ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. This is a hormone that is released into the blood and has influence on our water and sodium balance. We're going to talk about the ANP peptide or ANP hormone when we look at the kidneys, because that's where they have their function. The kidneys are also a secondary endocrine gland themselves. They have a main role which involves detoxification and other important functions such as urine production, but they also have a job to produce erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that controls our red blood cell production. The GI tract is also a secondary endocrine gland in this way. It secretes CCK, secretin, and gastrin, which are hormones that are involved in absorption and digestion of food. And then the liver secretes IGF-like factors such as somatomedins, and that's also a secondary endocrine role. And then we've got the skin and the kidneys, which help to not secrete, but convert vitamin D into its active form, which is 1,2,5-dihydroxycholecalciferol. That's a really long name, which simply means the activated or the bioavailable form of vitamin D. Okay, or vitamin D3. So the skin and kidneys can also be considered secondary endocrine glands because they can convert that inactive vitamin D, which is typically what we're exposed to in sunlight or what we take in through our diet, into its activated or available form to be absorbed. And then lastly, our fat cells or our adipocytes can secrete leptin, and that is another role of a hormone, right? Leptin is going to control our hunger levels and control our fasting versus fed states, okay? So these glands, these organs rather, can be considered endocrine glands. So they're not necessarily glandular tissue, as you can see in some of the cases. The heart is not a gland, the kidney is not a gland, but because they secrete some of these important hormones as a secondary function, we can consider them secondary glands or secondary endocrine glands. All right, let's move on to lecture objective 2, which is to describe the links between the hypothalamus with the anterior and posterior pituitary lobes. And that is really the hypothalamo-anterior pituitary axis or hypothalamo-pituitary feedback, okay? So as I mentioned before, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are two of our master endocrine glands that are located in the brain. The hypothalamus is located just beneath the thalamus. So if you can recall some of the anatomy from our brain unit, we know this region is the thalamus. Just beneath it, this region here is the hypothalamus. We've got some important neurosecretory nerve endings here. And then just beneath that, we've got the pituitary gland. So the thalamus, hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland here. And so this very small area of the central nervous system controls all of our endocrine organs, control all of our endocrine glands. And it relates to each other and also down to these various hormones which are located throughout the body. So the first thing is that the pituitary gland has two further divisions. It's got an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. It's also got an infundibulum. So the infundibulum is this stalk-like connection that communicates from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And so the infundibulum is where the communication goes to create this axis that I talked about. So the hypothalamus can be considered the CEO or the main gland that's involved or in charge, and then the pituitary can be considered sort of the second in command. And so there must be communication from the hypothalamus or instruction down to the pituitary gland.